In the last video, we talked about some different reading strategies for the different levels of reading that you're going to do. This video is going to talk about analyzing a story formally by looking at the formal and stylistic elements. Now, this can be applied to any kind of literature. We're going to keep working on Story of an Hour, so we'll be talking about stories and fiction for this particular video. If you haven't read Story of an Hour yet, make sure that you pause this video and go ahead and do that now. So when we're analyzing a story, sometimes we do this during our first reading, but definitely during like a second reading through. What we're really trying to figure out is how the formal and stylistic elements work together to create the effect that we get with the story. This can be confusing, especially in a lot of interpretive literature where it doesn't give you everything tied up in a neat bow. It sometimes is actually very difficult to read or to understand. So getting through these formal elements, analyzing them, naming them, labeling them can help us start to see the different parts of a piece of fiction, a poem, or drama. So for fiction, probably the first thing that we really want to look at is the story itself, the plot. Those are the sequence of events in a story. And in a traditionally structured story, the events are going to mirror the traditional plot pyramid that you've probably learned before, with exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and denouement or resolution. Now, some stories don't follow this. Sometimes we get flashbacks or flash forwards. They kind of interfere with the chronology. But usually, even if we're getting the chronology different, the emotional impact of the story itself is following this plot structure. But paying attention to where the plot moves and changes is really important. So going through the Story of an Hour, we can think about the different events of the story and whether they line up with the plot pyramid. In this case, it does. It moves from, Josephine and Richard's breaking the news of Mrs. Mallard's husband's death through to her heart attack at the end. And those events match up really quite nicely with the traditional plot structure. So we know that our author isn't trying to say anything about how we experience life or time. Any kind of changes in the plot structure matching the story chronology, it tells us something about how we perceive our lives, how we perceive time, and what that even means to have chronology. But in this case, it's pretty straightforward. Other things that you want to pay attention to in plot is just how time passes. Even though this is a really straightforward story, beginning to end, we don't have a lot of jumps around in time, it does do some strange things. And anytime a story, a poem, or a drama is doing something that seems kind of odd is a good place to start analysis and interpretation. So in this case, this is called a Story of an Hour, but you probably read it in about 8 minutes. We are missing long moments in the narrative. When she cries in her sister's arms and when she stares out the window, there are minutes that go by that are not narrated, that are just lost from the narrative. So as much as our plot and story line up, they're not a direct one-to-one. So that does tell us something a little bit about kind of how compressed the time is, how quickly things seem to happen. The next thing we can really analyze is character. Remember, there's always a protagonist. That's the character that we know the most about. It's the character that we identify with, even if we don't like them. In this case, we have Mrs. Mallard as our protagonist, and we know a few things about her. She's a wife, she's a sister, but one of the things that should kind of jump out to you is we don't really know her name until almost nearly the end. She is just Mrs. Mallard. Like, her first name is Mrs. for most of this text. We do get a few details about her in the text. We learn that she's actually quite sad and quite aware of what's happening. She's not in denial when she learns about her husband's death. She gets it immediately. She's not an idiot. We also know she's young, that she's probably fairly pretty, but even though she's young, she has lines on her face, that she's had enough happen in her life that things have not necessarily been super, super easy. The narrator tells us that she has a certain strength. It gives us kind of a positive appreciation for her, even though we don't really see her do much. We should also look at the setting. Oftentimes setting functions as a character in the story. It's hugely important. You think about your own setting, where you grew up, the places you know and how they affect you. Setting is an essential aspect of any story. So in this particular story, we don't have a specific setting mentioned, so we have to look at context clues. The story was written in 1894. That means that the story could not exist after it unless it's sci-fi. This is a contemporary story, so it's probably of that time period. And then those context clues give us the idea that we're right about that. It talks about a railroad disaster. It talks about a second telegram. So we know that this isn't a story that happened, in the Renaissance. We also know it's springtime, and that it's after the rain. So setting has everything to do from the big world setting all the way down to the kind of minutia of the weather and how the weather affects the story's mood. And it does, right? Springtime and rain usually signal some sort of like new birth or hopefulness, whereas if a story takes place in a storm, like one of Chopin's other stories, it creates a completely different mood for the story. So setting can have a lot of different valences about how we appreciate the events and the characters. The next thing that we want to pay attention to is narrative and point of view. There's only a limited number of types of narration that we can have. In this case, we have a third-person limited omniscient narrator. We mostly get Mrs. Mallard's point of view and inner thoughts. But we don't get this omniscient godlike narrator, right? We don't know what her sister thinks. We don't know what Bentley Mallard thinks when she collapses on the steps. This story would be really difficult to tell in first person because Mrs. Mallard is not self-aware. She doesn't even have an epiphany for about half of the story. So we really do need a third-person narrator who can narrate for us and tell Mrs. Mallard's stories for her because she doesn't have the consciousness to be able to step back from her own life and interpret it the way that a third-person narrator does. And we get that in some of these little asides. So the narrator tells us, when she's looking, it's not that she's reflecting. It's actually that she's not even thinking about anything. It was a suspension of intelligent thought. So a lot of times the narrator is interpreting things for us that the character herself can't understand, which should tell you something about her agency and women's agencies in general. So those are your formal elements. Once you have your formal elements, you want to pay attention to how those stylistic features help to add to the story, build on them, contradict them, or just give an overall impression. We have very short story here. It's like less than 2 pages long. So anywhere that a story this short is giving you imagery, it's probably important. Right? And we get this very long image of the open window and the treetops and the rain and the peddler and the song and the sparrows and all of this information in a story that doesn't actually give us much information. So the fact that there is more life outside that window that she is starting to appreciate should signal to you that the outside world has something bigger and more interesting than her internal world does. We can also look at figurative language. The story plays with the term heart disease, heart being both her literal heart, the organ that beats, and heart being that kind of metaphorical heart that we have that deals with emotions and joy and love, right? So when we hear that she was afflicted with a heart trouble at first, it's true, she does have a defective, like literal organ of the heart, but what we learn throughout the story is that heart disease kind of takes on a metaphorical or a symbolic meaning because she's been kind of repressed in her life. So she's been kind of held back from true joy. As we do this, we really want to start identifying themes. And remember, themes are those big general ideas, those abstract concepts that a story is questioning, presenting, in conversation with. So when you find a quote or you find an image or you find a symbol or something in the text that kind of draws your attention, see if you can list the types of themes that might be related to that. So for instance, for this particular quote, this could be about themes of oppression, themes about marriage or mourning and death. It could be themes about men's and women's relationships. So as you think about these different themes, if you're making a list, what you're going to start seeing is repetition in those lists. And when you see a theme repeat with different parts of the formal or stylistic features, then you know you probably have something that is important to understanding your interpretation. Now, one thing we haven't really talked about is outside information because we've been focused on a formal analysis. That means just looking at the text itself. Sometimes this is called a close reading or formalism, but oftentimes formal analysis isn't enough to figure out a story in its whole complexity. A lot of times you need outside information or a different lens to look through, and that's what our next video is going to be about. So if you haven't already, make sure that you've read Story of an Hour, kind of go through and see if you can identify some of these formal, stylistic, and thematic elements that I've pointed out. And then when you're ready, you can move on to the next video.